the object, and therefore from that point of view you can follow up from a sales point of view. So you get very early stage sales leads. To the point I've just made, which is if you know very early on that you've been specified by, for instance, an architect or perhaps some other design professional, then you can track that and you can avoid product substitution. You know, I don't know, I guess that you're no different than most other folks, which is you don't know how much business you've lost because you've been value engineered out because you never knew you were in the first place. If you can identify people who are specifying your products by name and you can contact them, then you can start to build deeper relationships with them. It's kind of, you know, like one-to-one marketing. So you're now in a situation where you can identify individuals who actually are disposed towards your products and you can use them on a community basis, which of course then allows you to think about, well, perhaps we'll start using digital marketing. So some of the early adopters of, from a manufacturing point of view, have now got quite strong social communities in terms of people who share information about the use of their products. You could basically test campaign effectiveness. So if, for instance, you ran a campaign in the London area and the call to action was basically to do something in the virtual world with objects, then you could measure that very easily and basically see what the pull-through effect is in terms of that particular campaign. And the last point, and I've kind of already alluded to this a bit, as manufacturers, you spend, I'm sure, an inordinate amount of time maintaining the quality of your products in the physical world. Are you really going to allow somebody else to actually control the quality of those products in the virtual world? Because the physical world is becoming less important as we get further and further into this BIM stuff and into collaborative business processes than the virtual world. Because the virtual world will dictate what happens in the real world in the future. Now, is that going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years? Absolutely not. You know, the construction industry, to get to collaborative business processes, may take a whole generation. There are a huge number of obstacles, not least of which the kind of contractual frameworks that we have today, etc. But there's a very strong push to move in that direction. So that might be just a simple question of looking at what we do today and how we can lever with the additional and new information that we're getting about who's using our products, what we can do with that from a business performance point of view. Maybe you could think about new strategies, ones that you haven't been able to achieve before because you can now identify people by name. Could you now differentiate yourself in the digital world in a way that you may not be able to in the real world? So, for instance, if you have a commodity product and your products are very similar to everyone else's, are there aspects that you could provide in the virtual world that would actually help those people who are trying to use those products? An example would be, I can think of a small manufacturing company who's up near Nottingham called Cubicle Systems. They're they basically put together, as it says, cubicles for showers and for toilet blocks, etc. Their single biggest competitive advantage is the fact that most people can only respond in 6 to 8 weeks. They can respond in 2 weeks. But what they've basically done is to offer to the architects the ability to send them part of their model, which is the empty washroom. They will model it with all of the components that are required, and they will guarantee to manufacture it within 2 weeks. That's using the virtual world to give yourself a competitive advantage. Could you offer a bigger or different solution? So this is kind of who might you consider now collaborating with, perhaps in a way that you didn't before. So I'll give you an example of that. There's something called the Department of Health P21 Plus program. Anyone familiar with that? Okay. The intention of that is basically to try and get to a standardized definition of what should go into various medical facilities. But actually beyond that, what they're now trying to push for is, and you know, this is happening in other areas as well, what they're trying to push for is, if I've got a patient room in a hospital, we all know that it's going to have a wash basin in it, taps, it's going to have an air supply, it's going to have a CO2 supply, it's going to have electrical connections, 6 of or whatever it is, it's going to have a bed of one description or another, etc. So rather than that all coming together as a series of individual products, what if there was one object, one model of this patient room, which basically had all of those components in it, and from a design point of view, you just pick it up and you drop it into your design. If it's the wrong bed because this happens to be an orthopedic ward rather than a standard patient, fine. You just take out the bed and you replace it with something else. So we are driving further and further into how do we put together solutions rather than individual components. So particularly where products come together in conjunction with other products, I think increasingly we're going to see that solution approach being required by the industry simply because it's a much more efficient way for them to perform. If you know who values your products, and this is a bit like the previous one in terms of knowing who your dedicated customers are, if you like, who really likes you, what could you do differently with that information? So if you've got this community of people who know and love you, could you use them for market research purposes? Could you use them for other mechanisms to basically help you promote your product? Could you use them as a community? And finally, could the project information, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, could the project information impact perhaps how you work as manufacturers? An example is, there's a very large construction company or contracting company in Sweden called FIA BIM, about the same size as Lang O'Rourke, but they only work in Sweden. I didn't realise there was that much building going on in Sweden, but still. And they have come to an agreement with one of their door suppliers, in fact the biggest door supplier in Sweden, that because PIAB are obviously able to plan in advance reasonably anyway, what they're going to be doing in terms of project development over the next 9 months to 12 months, they've come to an agreement which basically says with the door manufacturer, if you can tell us 6 months, at least 6 months in advance, what you're going to require, and we're typically talking about here, for instance, a hospital which may require 1,200, 1,500 doors. If you can tell us 6 months, at least 6 months in advance what you're going to require, then what we will basically do is to offer you an extra 5% discount because we can plan our production properly. So all of these things in the electronic world are starting to have the same impact that we see the kind of exchange of data having had in other industries. Now, something that I don't like to think about too much is that I'm old enough to remember the introduction of EPOS into the retail industry in the UK. And EPOS, as you're probably aware, is just barcodes and basically the ability to scan products so that you know exactly where it is in the supply chain or coming off the shelf or going through the till. And the retailers that understood that very well very early on are the people that you see on the high street today, Tesco's, Sainsbury's, etc. They understood the power of EPOS very early on. And of course, they now have the power to completely control their supply chain as a result of that. I'd have to say my fear in all of this is the kingpins in all of this are going to be the main contractors. And if the main contractors can get their head around how to basically gather and utilize all of this data, then in practical terms, they will have the ability to control their downstream and upstream supply chains very powerfully. Now, it might take them 10 years to get there, and it might require quite a lot of consolidation in terms of the contractors that we've got today. But my fear is that that's exactly what will happen. They will have, because they are the hub where all the data will be gathered, they have the ability with that data basically to manage up and down the supply chain in a way that's never been possible before. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say today. We would like to, from a BIM for M2 point of view, engage with this particular trade association to help the development of product data templates for the manufacturers that are represented here today. It will require that 2 or 3 of the manufacturers will need to stick their hands up and basically say, we would like to do this on behalf of the association, and then share the results of that with the membership to get sign-off. But we will help and support that, and we'd be delighted to do that. So, any further questions? Yes?
I deal with the consultants, and one of the questions, one of the concerns was the quantity of information at various project levels.
Yep.
And one consultancy said that they would like to see 2 versions of our BIM models, one at the very early stages, stages A, B, and C. And then when it comes down to E and F, full product information, they wanted then a full-blown version of the code.
Yep.
And that is the dilemma we have, I think, as an industry, of how much information we provide at the different levels. Should we just have one model, or should we have 2 models for each of our products?
Okay. Well, first of all, if I just take the requirement that we have today, so just let's focus on BIM level 2 and COBE. It's basically described as level of development, and within level of development there is level of detail and level of information. So level of detail is the geometric representation, level of information is the data representation, and right now there's a request, or the structure that has been put forward and has been adopted is basically that there should be 5 levels. In practical terms, nobody's interested in 5 levels. They kind of more equate to what's happened in the US with their 100, 200, 300, etc. Basically, what you end up with is at the lowest level, it's a block. It just occupies a bit of space. So if you're doing a concept design, you can say that boiler is going to occupy that amount of space, and I can stick it in the right place and have the orientation the right way around so I know where the front is. The next level, level 2, puts a bit more geometric data in, representation in. Then you get to the next one, which is 3, which is typically what most people go for, a 3. And then you get to a 5, and the 5 basically can look like a photorealistic view of the product. Okay? So there are these various graduations in terms of how it is visually represented. So today you'll basically see that most BIM objects that are produced have at least 3 in there. If you're going to go to 5, you can do, but in practical terms, it has no value today, and I can't see it having any value in the future. As far as the data is concerned, that also is graduated. So typically at the lowest level, which is level 1, you will just have the manufacturer name and probably the product name in there, and that's pretty much it. But by the time you get to 5, you've got the full specification which will allow you to produce COBie. Okay. So the question is, if you provide more data, what's going to happen? Well, 2 things. First of all, in terms of that data that I described in terms of putting into that product data sheet, I said that that product data sheet could sit on the boundary, and basically the virtual world can pull out of that what it wants. Because as long as it's available, people can download it and they can pull out what they want. The other way of addressing that is, from a BIM object, I'm going to put my BIM object hat on for a minute. From a BIM object point of view, we recognise this as being a problem some time ago. Now, everybody else who provides objects basically provides objects by including the data locked into the geometric object. We don't. The data is divorced from the geometric object, and it sits as a series of data sets. And at the point at which the designer wants to include that particular set of data, they go, and it gets included, and it's then embedded into the object. So you can have 5, 10 different sets of data. This is particularly relevant when you get, for instance, to products that are available on an international basis, because you want that data available in 25 languages. That's no problem. If you end up being a manufacturer that has one geometric object that is the same around Europe, but is going to be required in 28 different countries, right now, you'd need, for most people, you'd need 28 different geometric objects with 28 different languages recorded in there. For us, it's one object, because the geometry is exactly the same, but it's a series of different data sets, and depending upon whether you're working in English or in German or French or whatever it might be. Now, that becomes even more powerful when you think about it from the fact that if I'm an architect working in the UK, sure, my native language is English, but in practical terms, I might be working on a German project. So therefore, what I actually want is the German object, not the English object. So, there are lots of ifs and buts in all of this. So, I'd have to say that the whole of the creation of and I've written an article on this, the whole of the creation of objects within the world at the moment is still very much in its infancy. It's still a craft industry. There are a whole bunch of professionals out there who think that they know what they're doing, and to a great extent, a lot of them don't.